Hi everyone. I'm going to walk you through how to think about images and photography as we move forward in this first section. This week what you're going to do is set up an Instagram account with a particular theme. And then what you're going to do is try and take some photographs either with your phone or with a camera. It's your choice. And we're going to walk through some things to think about if you're going to take pictures. I'd encourage you to try using a camera and try using some of the more advanced functions. You don't have to, but uh, it might help you take some pictures that you might not be able to get otherwise. But remember the adage, the best camera is the one that you have with you. So if you have your phone, you want to capture the moment and do what you can. Um, so I wanted to just talk you through a couple of images and things to think about. One of the things, this is a picture that ran a while back in the Springfield News Leader, and it captured a soda fountain that was in the Ozarks. And I just want you to kind of take a peep at it and think about what's going on here, right? If we look closely at it, no one's looking at the camera. You've got activity. You have like at least three storylines that are going on here, right? You have these two kids in the middle that are interacting and eating. Maybe it's after school. You have the busy person behind the counter who's obviously occupied by something else and not paying attention to them. And then you have another girl that's there, and apparently there's someone on her lap because you can kind of see a leg there. So you start to explore and say, this really captures a sense of place, you really start to dig into it and study it and make sense of it. Now, there are some other things you need to think about in this picture. If you look closely, this is actually taken in the aisle of a drugstore, and there's some depth to it. So you've got the person behind the counter, you've got the girls that are a little bit closer to you, you have the glasses that are a little bit closer. So there's some perspective in here to think about. They've also thought a lot about how to compose the photograph. So you notice the mirror back here and you notice you can't see the photographer. So it's those little things that you want to pay attention to as you're framing your photograph before you take it. Don't just point and shoot. Think about where this is and how you might frame it. And in this case, they also wanted to make sure to capture all of the signs and not cut off any of the signs. So there's a lot to think about as you're composing your photograph and putting it together. Okay, we're going to go to the next one. So as we start to think about taking pictures, one of the things that's going to come up a lot this semester is thinking about file types. Um, and what goes into how our computer processes different things. And anytime you're dealing with media files, you're going to deal with uncompressed files and compressed files. And basically what the compressed files do is there's an algorithm at work and it tries to shrink the file size so it's not quite as large. That's really important for web design, and it's something you should start to think about, especially if you're going to be a web designer or media creator. It's always best when you start off, if you have the room on your SD cards, to capture media in the uncompressed form in the largest format possible. The only problem is that when you do that, the stuff is really, really large. So when you have a raw file from your camera, if you have a 20 megapixel picture, it can easily be, a couple dozen megabytes. It can be a huge file that is just a lot to deal with and work with. And when you compress it, it's about 1/4 of the size. And that's going to be true for video, that's true for audio. So this is a theme that's going to be coming up throughout the course, so you want to be aware of it. Um, for photographs, the best compressed format is JPEG, but you may run into seeing what's called PNG. The reason why I bring up these other file types is you sometimes will see graphics that are either PNGs or GIFs, and what that comes from is the PNG files and the GIF files have what's called transparency, which is you can cut something out and then it won't have any color background. It will take the color of whatever you put the picture upon. The other thing that you run into, GIFs can be animated. And you've all seen them with memes, and that's why they're called GIFs, because that's the particular file type, but that's the main one that uses that. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about what to think about when you take a good photo. Notice that first photo we looked at was what I would call a documentary photo. It was capturing life as it happens. Staged photos or posed photos have a purpose, especially for portraits. But most of what I want to push you to do for what we're doing in this class is try to focus more on the documentary aspect, unless you have a particular theme that requires portraits. Um, but what I want you to think with the documentary photos, I want you to get used to capturing life as it happens. That way it doesn't look like a stock photo. And we all have made fun of stock photos because they tend to be staged of people doing things. Shoot at an interesting angle. The photo that we looked at was straight on. Sometimes just bending your knees or standing on a chair can give you a slightly different perspective and a much more interesting photograph. So sometimes you want to think about that and give that a try. Make sure you have a primary subject or focal point. Don't just take a general space. You want to make sure that there's some sort of focus that point to the picture. We talked about adding depth to the photo. So sometimes one way that you can do that is instead of shooting straight on, shoot from an angle. And sometimes that can provide a more interesting perspective as well. The other thing you want to pay close attention to, photography is all about light. So really pay attention to the light and shade that you're seeing when you go out and shoot. You also want to pay attention, if you're shooting outdoors, pay attention to time of day. Usually the best times to shoot are early in the morning when the sun is low, and at dusk. That's when you're going to get the most interesting light for your photograph. So that's something to think about, especially if you're going to do portraits. You can shoot some, and you're going to shoot somebody outside. Those are better than like at high noon when the sun's at its height and everything's super bright, because that washes out some of your colors. So all of that some stuff you should think about as you're shooting your photographs. I don't talk about flash here. I would just be cautious with flash, especially built-in flashes that are straight on. They're harsh, they're unnatural. If it's possible to shoot without flash, I would encourage you to turn off the flash function or turn off the auto flash so that you're capturing natural light, even in low light. This is another reason why you want to use a better camera rather than your phone. It tends to do better in low light, especially your higher end cameras. Okay, here's another thing that I wanted to show you. So here's another documentary photograph. Again, it comes from the Springfield News Leader. You see there's a lot going on here. You study it, you want to learn what is going on here. You can see there's a fire behind them. Is that a wildfire that they have to put out? Then that's where the caption's going to come in and tell you a little bit more about the photograph. You can see these are firefighters. Given their dress, they're probably volunteer firefighters, and they're having to deal with these wildfire that's going on in the field. So there's a lot to look at. This photograph I also wanted to show you. You may have heard the term rule of thirds, which is basically saying, let's divide the picture into a grid. And when we do that, what we can do is we want to make sure the subject of the photographs is at one of these corner points. That just creates more visual interest than putting something smack dab in the center of your photograph. Again, this is a guideline. I know it's called rule of thirds and you don't have to follow it, but when you're in a pinch, it's a good framework for doing this. Some cameras and camera apps for your phones will actually add this overlay when you're shooting a picture, and that can help you as you're composing your photographs. I want to touch on a couple of legal issues. What we're going to be doing is shooting our own photographs. Something to be aware of: when you shoot your photograph and you post it, it's yours. It's copyrighted. You don't necessarily have to register it. But that goes another way, right? So you can search for photographs on the web, but your assumption should be all photographs are copyrighted. Don't just pull something off and use somebody's photo and put it on your web page or on your Instagram, because you're basically stealing somebody's work. So what you want to pay close attention to is to say, Does someone grant a Creative Commons license where all you have to do is give them permission? Or is it from a source that is royalty free, such as if you go to the NASA has some wonderful photographs, and because they are a government agency, a federal government agency, you can use those photographs. So that's something to keep in mind as you're using photos and creating your own photos. There are instances of what's called fair use. So you can use some photographs for some purposes. The thing that's tricky about this with photographs is you're basically using all of the work. So it's hard to claim fair use. Like the analogy I would use is, say I have a book and I'm reviewing the book and I want to tell people some part of the book, so I will pull a paragraph out from the book and put it on my blog post. That's not most of the book. That's one small section of the book, and because I'm using it for criticism, I can probably, it would fall under fair use and I wouldn't get hammered or sued for using one small part. But with a photograph, I'm using the entire photograph. So it's just something to think about when fair use comes up with content. Okay, so you probably looked at a fancy camera, or maybe not so much a fancy camera, but just a point and shoot that has a little um, gauge that has these letters on it. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things to you. That stands for aperture. And then there's also manual mode and shutter mode. And those are basically ways that you can control certain facets of the camera to have a little more control over what happens with your photograph. So aperture is one when you want to use the blurring of the background, and shutter speed is when you're trying to capture or get a little bit of creative blur when you're shooting things like sports or movement. Those are what those two settings are for. So if we think about this, these are your primary settings you should know. So aperture is basically the size of the opening, and the wider it is, the shallower the depth of field, which means does the background get blurry? And the narrower the aperture, or the larger the number. And it's usually designated by what's called the f-stop. So basically what you're saying, that whenever you see like f2.8, that's a wide aperture. If you see f16 or f11, that's going to be a narrower aperture, which means more of the picture will be in focus. And then the shutter speed, the faster that speed is, basically the shorter the amount of time. You may see like 1/400th of a second or 1/800th of a second. The faster that is, the less blur there's going to be in the photograph. And then the last number that you will see pop up is ISO, which is basically how sensitive is the sensor to light. The more sensitive it is, the more noise you're going to get, which means like distortion or in the photograph. It's good that if you have a lot of light or you're shooting in daylight, I'd start with the lowest, which is typically ISO 100. Most cameras, once you get above like 3200, you're going to start getting some noise in the photograph. One of the things, another adage that some people will bring up is it's better to have the picture in focus with a little bit of noise than to have less noise and blur. And so you kind of have to go with whatever the light conditions are as you're using these three facets of the exposure triangle. Some cameras also have an exposure control. So once it sets all of those, you can actually say, I want a slightly higher exposure or lower, and that's typically in increments of a half or a third. So you'll like do plus 1/3, plus 2/3, plus 1 1/3, something along those lines, or minus, depending on whether you want it darker or lighter. Okay, this is a nice grid that sort of helps you visualize it. So I mentioned f2, f2.8. You can see how blurry the background gets depending on how wide open the aperture is. And then the shutter speed is going to give you what kind of blur you're getting. Typically, what you want to do, 1/125th is a pretty good base speed to make sure that you don't have blur. And then this is the noisiness. So as your ISO gets higher, it's going to get noisier and noisier in the picture. So this is a good grid, and you'll see these in Springfield Hall in the lab. There's one of these on the wall that helps you make sense of this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you're going to do this week. So one of the things that I want you to do is you're going to be setting up an Instagram account. And what I want you to do is not necessarily set up a personal Instagram account. I want you to set up something with a theme or something that you're interested in. And then that will be your theme for the semester, where you can take some pictures and shoot different things. Basically, what you're looking for on this Instagram account is how do all your pictures fit together and reveal something about you or about your theme, right? So if you look here, I do have a couple of personal pictures, but most of what I put on mine is not personal. I tend to go sort of artsy nature. I like to do a lot of macro photography, and I like to just capture the world around me. And then you can put a little bit in your profile, put a link to your site. Those are some things that you want on your Instagram profile. So what do I mean by theme? So one account that has popped up is SGF Concerts, and this is basically all concert photography that's in the Springfield area. It is, this photographer does his own stuff, but he also uses a hashtag and features other people. So that's a good way to get engagement. Remember in the previous video I had you watch, we talked about engagement. Here's another one that I like. It's called Lovely Dead Crap. This is actually a national, international Instagram account, and it has 40,000 followers. And it's basically pictures shooting artistic photos, usually macro photographs of dying plants and dying nature and things that are fading away. And it has become a very popular account. You don't have to do things that are necessarily that artistic. You can do things that are more thematic. So reading is hot. If you look at this, this has more of a thematic sense. So it's kind of artsy photographs that involve coffee and books and pastries and just, you kind of, as you look at all these photos in total, you just get this sense of relaxation. Um, Although some of these kind of go off the beaten path to me. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. That's not quite what I was looking for. Takes me out of my mellow mood. So that's something you want to make sure is that you have some consistency on these. Okay. And then lastly, what you want to do is think about how the pictures fit together in your feed. You notice how when I look at them in this way, it's a slightly different experience than when I look at them individually. Something else we're going to be doing this week is you're going to use an Instagram app that's called Instagram Layout, which is basically how do I combine more than one photograph in the frame to convey a narrative. And so I really like this one because it's not just frivolous, it actually has a point. So you can see the real person and the illustrated version of this person and something how it tells you a little something about them in the caption. Don't forget about the importance of the caption. For engagement, if you notice, the best Instagram accounts will tell a little story here and use some hashtags to connect their audience and bring people in. And that's another thing that you want to do. Really examine the hashtags that are available for you for the things that you are showing the pictures of. Okay.